Hey, welcome to Agnes Thompson's channel. My name's Eleanor, and I'm going to share my story with you.
My home, an old 1920s craftsman, stood on a quiet, maple-lined street in Portland, Oregon. Its wide porch, overgrown with wild grapevines, always felt like an embrace, inviting me into a world where time flowed by its own special rules. It wasn't just a house, it was a living organism, breathing with stories, laughter, and, in recent years, the quiet but persistent echo of illness. Eleanor Vance, was 68, and for the past 10 years, I had dedicated myself to caring for my husband, Arthur, whose consciousness slowly but relentlessly faded, like a candle in a draft. Every morning began the same way. At 6:30 a.m., I would go down to the kitchen, where the scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the aroma of old wood and damp earth from the garden. I'd brew 2 cups, one for myself, strong and black, the other, a bit weaker, for Arthur. Then, I'd walk into our bedroom, where he lay, immersed in a sleep that grew deeper and more unsettling with each passing day. His face, once so expressive, had over the years acquired a childlike serenity, and his gaze, when he was awake, often wandered, as if searching for something long lost. I would sit on the edge of the bed, gently touching his hand. His skin was thin, almost transparent, like tissue paper. "Good morning, dear," I would whisper, and sometimes, just sometimes, his fingers would faintly squeeze mine in return. This was all that remained of our once vibrant, rich communication. Our good morning now consisted of this weak touch and my quiet promise to be there. Caring for Arthur became my life. The Alzheimer's diagnosis 10 years ago struck us like a bolt from the blue, but we accepted it with dignity, with the stoicism that, I believed, was characteristic of our generation. We had been together for 45 years, and I couldn't imagine any other path than to be by his side until the very end. Our children, Sarah and Michael, lived their own lives. Sarah, my eldest, was a successful marketing manager at a large tech company. Her life was a whirlwind of deadlines, presentations, and endless business trips. She called once a week, asked about Dad, expressed sympathy, but her voice always sounded as if she were speaking from another dimension, where time was measured not by hours spent at a sickbed, but by minutes spent in meetings. Michael, my youngest, was an artist. He lived in Seattle, struggled for recognition, and his world was full of abstract ideas and financial difficulties. He visited less often than Sarah, but when he did, his presence was more tangible, though helpless. He tried to help but didn't know how, and his attempts often ended in awkward silence. My grandchildren, Emily and Ben, were typical of their generation. Emily, a 20-year-old college student, was absorbed in her studies and social media. Ben, a 17-year-old high schooler, lived in a world of video games and sports training. They loved me, I knew that, but our connection was thin, almost ephemeral. I tried to share something with them that I considered important, my famous apple crisp, a recipe from my grandmother passed down through generations, or stories about how Arthur and I built this house with our own hands, or how my father, a carpenter, taught me to distinguish wood by its scent. "Grandma, that's so sweet, but I don't have time for baking. I'll just order something from the bakery," Emily said once when I offered to teach her how to bake the crisp. She was looking at her phone, her fingers fluttering across the screen like butterflies. And those stories, they're interesting, of course, but I have to finish my art history essay. Ben was even more detached. "Grandma, that's cool, but I have to practice," he'd reply when I tried to show him old photos or tell him about how Arthur and I traveled the country in our old van. His world was digital, fast-paced, and my analog memories seemed dusty and irrelevant to him. I felt an invisible wall growing between us, woven from generational differences, priorities, and ways of perceiving the world. My knowledge, my experience, my traditions, all of it seemed to be turning into something outdated, unnecessary, into junk that needed to be thrown away. Sometimes I felt lonely, even with Arthur beside me. His presence was ghostly, his consciousness distant. I was his caregiver, his nurse, his voice, but not his conversational partner. I managed his medications, oversaw his hygiene, cooked his meals, made sure he didn't fall. Navigating the American healthcare system for seniors, Medicare, and Medicaid was a true labyrinth. Endless calls, forms, denials, appeals. I became an expert at it, but every call cost me nerve cells. We lived on his small pension and my modest savings, which dwindled before my eyes like snow in the spring sun. Extra insurance, medication costs. Sometimes I hired an aide for a few hours a week to get a little break. It was hard, exhausting work, but I did it with love because Arthur was my life. In the last 2 years, as Arthur's condition significantly worsened, we hired a private nurse, Brenda Miller. She came recommended by an agency, seemed competent and caring. Brenda was a woman in her 40s, with a soft voice and perceptive eyes. She quickly gained Arthur's trust, as much as was possible in his state. She knew how to approach him, how to make him smile, something I hadn't been able to achieve in a long time. I was grateful to her for that, for those rare moments when Arthur seemed almost like himself again. Brenda spent 20 hours a week with him, sometimes staying overnight when I needed to rest or run errands. She became part of our lives, almost a family member. I shared my worries with her, told her about Arthur's and my life, about our dreams. She listened attentively, nodded, expressed sympathy. I thought I had found an ally, someone who understood my pain. Sometimes, when Brenda was with Arthur, I tried to do my own things. Work in the garden, read a book I'd been putting off for months. But even then, my mind was tethered to the house, to Arthur. I heard their voices, Brenda's laughter, sometimes Arthur's quiet, incoherent words. I felt she knew how to relax him, to calm him. She brought him new books, played music he loved in his youth. I was glad he was feeling a little better. But there were oddities. Brenda often stayed longer than agreed, explaining it as a sudden worsening or the need to complete procedures. She became too insistent in her inquiries about our finances, asking about the will, about how we planned to manage Arthur in the future. She said she wanted to make sure everything would be all right, but her questions seemed too personal, too intrusive. I attributed it to her professional care, her desire to help. After all, she was a nurse, accustomed to such things. One day, I walked into Arthur's room and saw Brenda holding his hand while he signed something. My husband, who could barely hold a spoon, was scrawling illegible marks. "What's that?" I asked, and Brenda quickly hid the document. "Oh, it's just an insurance form, Eleanor, don't worry. Just routine paperwork." Her voice was too calm, her smile too wide. I felt a slight unease, but brushed it off. Arthur's mind wasn't what it used to be. He could sign anything if asked. I trusted Brenda. I had to trust her. I had no strength for suspicions, for a fight. The last few months were particularly difficult. Arthur barely got out of bed. His breathing became increasingly shallow. I slept beside him, listening to every rustle, every breath. On the night of April 12, 2025, as spring rain drummed on the roof, Arthur passed away. Quietly, peacefully, in his sleep. I held his hand until morning, feeling the warmth slowly leave his body. My heart ached with pain, but also with relief. His suffering was over. My suffering, I thought, was too. The funeral was modest, but dignified. Sarah and Michael came, bringing Emily and Ben. We gathered at our house after the service, remembering Arthur, sharing stories. Brenda Miller came too. She sat in a corner, quiet and unassuming, and I even thanked her for everything she had done for Arthur. She just smiled softly and said, "He was a wonderful man, Eleanor. I'll always remember him." A week after the funeral, as the first waves of grief began to recede, it was time to deal with affairs. Arthur's lawyer, Mr. Davis, called and invited us for the reading of the will. I expected routine, the house, small savings, all to me, and then, perhaps, to the children. Arthur and I had always talked about it. Our house was our joint creation, our sanctuary. We gathered in Mr. Davis's office. Me, Sarah, Michael. The air was charged with anticipation. Mr. Davis, an elderly, gray-haired man with kind eyes, cleared his throat. So, I will read the last will and testament of Arthur Vance, drawn up on November 15th, 2024. My heart skipped a beat. November 15th, 2024? That was just a few months before his death, when Arthur was already very ill. I knew nothing about this new will. The previous one had been drawn up 10 years ago, before his illness. Mr. Davis began to read, and his voice sounded like a verdict. He spoke of bank accounts, of small investments that were to go to me. I nodded, waiting for the main thing, the house. But then he uttered a name that made me freeze. And all my real and personal property, located at 1422 Elmwood Drive, Portland, Oregon, along with all its contents, I bequeath to my dear and devoted nurse, Brenda Miller. The silence in the room was deafening. I felt the blood drain from my face. What? That was all I could manage. Sarah's voice was sharp. What did you say, Mr. Davis? This must be some mistake. Michael looked as if he had just been punched. Mr. Davis seemed no less shocked. I understand your surprise, Mrs. Vance. The will was drawn up in accordance with all legal norms. Arthur signed it in the presence of 2 witnesses. But this is our home. My voice trembled. I cared for him for 10 years. I was his wife. Who is this Brenda Miller? He could barely speak in November. How could he have signed a will? Mr. Davis carefully explained that Brenda Miller was listed as the primary beneficiary of the house, and I, only as the recipient of small financial assets. He showed us Arthur's signature, illegible, shaky, but, according to the notary, authentic. My world collapsed. The house we built, where we raised our children, where I spent 10 years caring for my dying husband, now belonged to a stranger. A woman who had come into our lives just 2 years ago. The pain of betrayal was sharp, like a knife. Not only from Arthur, who I thought had always loved and cherished me, but also from Brenda, whom I considered a friend, almost a daughter. Sarah, my usually composed daughter, was furious. This is fraud. Dad wasn't in his right mind. How could he do this? Michael, usually calm, began pacing the room. We have to contest this, Mom. It's simply unthinkable. But Mr. Davis just shook his head. Contesting a will is very difficult, especially when it's drawn up according to all the rules. You need to prove that Arthur lacked capacity or that he was subjected to undue influence. This will require significant effort and expense, Mrs. Vance. His words echoed in my head, significant effort and expense. I had neither. My savings were almost depleted, and my strength was waning. I felt devastated, betrayed, cast adrift. The house, my sanctuary, my anchor in this world, had been taken. And all this, after 10 years of selfless care. I left Mr. Davis's office as if in a fog. The street, bathed in spring sunshine, seemed alien. Birds sang, children laughed, and my world lay in ruins. I looked at Sarah and Michael. Their eyes showed shock and helplessness. They were adults, but at that moment, they seemed as lost as I was. What now, Mom? Sarah asked, her voice full of despair. I didn't know. My mind was blank, except for one thought. How could this have happened? How could the man I loved and trusted do this? And how could this woman, Brenda, so coldly take what was ours? The drive home was long and agonizing. I looked out the car window, past familiar streets, houses, parks. But nothing seemed the same. Every house, every green lawn, every blooming lilac bush, all of it reminded me of my own, now lost, piece of paradise. When we pulled up to our house, it looked the same as always, cozy, welcoming. But now it was alien. It belonged to Brenda Miller. I imagined her walking into our bedroom, sitting on our porch, cooking in my kitchen. A cold, sharp rage began to rise within me, displacing the pain. This couldn't end like this. I couldn't let this happen. 10 years of my life, my love, my sacrifices, all of it couldn't just be thrown away. I walked into the house, and every object, every photograph, every book on the shelf screamed about Arthur's and my life. This was our legacy, our history. And I couldn't let a stranger take it. Sarah and Michael tried to comfort me, offered options. Maybe you can stay with me, Mom, Sarah said, but I knew her apartment was too small and her life too hectic. Or with me, Until we figure something out, Michael offered, but his own financial situation was unstable. I didn't want to be a burden. I had always been independent, always managed on my own. I sat in the armchair in the living room, looking at the old fireplace that Arthur and I had restored years ago. Fragments of Mr. Davis's phrases swirled in my head: undue influence, capacity. These words seemed like a key, my only hope. "I will fight," I said, and my voice, to my own surprise, sounded firm. Sarah and Michael looked at me. Their eyes showed surprise mixed with relief. "I won't give up our home." But how? How to fight the system, the legal intricacies, the woman who seemed to have so skillfully manipulated my husband. I felt small and vulnerable, but at the same time, a strength I had forgotten began to awaken within me. A strength that had helped me cope with difficulties throughout my life. I remembered how Arthur, when he was still in his right mind, always said, "Eleanor, you're the most stubborn woman I know. If you set your mind to something, you'll get it done." And now, as his words echoed in my memory, I realized he was right. I wouldn't give up. I began to recall everything that had happened in the last 2 years. Every strange behavior of Brenda's, every word of hers, every glance. I remembered how she discouraged me from bringing other nurses to Arthur, how she insisted on leaving them alone, how she gradually, imperceptibly, isolated him from me, from the children, from friends. She was like ivy, slowly but surely entwining a tree until it suffocates. My children, of course, didn't see it. They were too busy with their lives, their problems. They trusted me, and I trusted Brenda. I felt guilty for not noticing it sooner, for letting it happen. But now was not the time for self-reproach. Now was the time for action. I knew I needed a good lawyer. Not just someone who read wills, but someone who knew how to fight. Someone who understood what undue influence was and how to prove it. Someone who wouldn't be intimidated by difficulties. My gaze fell on an old photo album on the coffee table. On the cover was our wedding photo, Arthur's and mine. We were young, full of hope. I smiled through my tears. This house had witnessed our love, our lives. It was part of us. And I couldn't let a stranger make it part of a false story. I picked up the phone. It was time to search. It was time to fight. The first few days after the will was read were like being trapped in a sticky, viscous nightmare. Every morning, I woke with a heavy feeling in my chest, as if a huge stone lay upon it. The house I knew and loved now felt alien, a temporary refuge from which I was about to be evicted. I looked at my hands, at the wrinkles that were a map of my life, and thought, was all this for nothing? Did 10 years of self-sacrifice, sleepless nights, endless care, did all of it lead to me being left with nothing? Sarah and Michael tried to help, but their help was more emotional than practical. Sarah called constantly, expressing sympathy and anger. "Mom, this is just outrageous. We have to do something." But her do something amounted to abstract appeals. Michael, when he visited, tried to tidy the garden or cook me dinner, but his clumsy attempts only highlighted his helplessness in the face of such a massive problem. They were absorbed in their own lives, their careers, their families. My fight was mine alone. I knew I needed a lawyer. Not Mr. Davis, who, though a decent man, was clearly not a fighter. I needed someone who understood the intricacies of probate law, someone who knew how to prove undue influence and incapacity. I started searching. Days and nights I spent at the computer, researching law firms in Portland, reading reviews, delving into terms that once seemed like Greek to me: probate litigation, elder law, contested wills. The name Evelyn Reed kept popping up. Her firm, Reed and Partners, specialized in cases involving seniors and contested wills. The reviews about her were impressive: Iron Lady, uncompromising, fair. I booked a consultation, not knowing what awaited me. Evelyn's office was in a modern downtown building, quite unlike Mr. Davis's cozy, slightly old-fashioned office. Evelyn herself turned out to be a woman in her 50s, with a short haircut and perceptive, yet kind eyes. She exuded a confidence and calm that I sorely lacked. "Mrs. Vance, I've reviewed your case," she said when I sat across from her. Her voice was low and even. "It's complex, but not hopeless." I told her everything. About 10 years of caring for Arthur, about his slow decline, about Brenda Miller's appearance, about her persistent questions, about how she isolated Arthur, about the strange insurance form he signed. I spoke at length in detail, trying not to miss a single point. Evelyn listened attentively, taking notes. The main challenge in cases like this, Mrs. Vance, is to prove that Arthur lacked what's called testamentary capacity at the time he signed the will, or that he was subjected to undue influence, Evelyn explained. Capacity means that a person understands what they are signing, to whom they are leaving their property, and who their heirs are. Undue influence is when someone uses their position to force a person to change their will. But how do you prove that? I asked, feeling the hope that had just appeared begin to fade again. It requires gathering evidence, Evelyn replied. Arthur's medical records, testimonies from doctors, nurses, neighbors, friends. Any evidence of his confused state, forgetfulness, changes in behavior. And, of course, proof that Brenda Miller had the opportunity and motive to exert such influence. She explained that Brenda, as a private nurse, had a unique opportunity to spend a lot of time alone with Arthur, which created ideal conditions for manipulation. This is a classic scenario, Mrs. Vance. A vulnerable elderly person, a caring but unrelated individual who gradually gains trust and then begins to dictate their will. I felt a surge of anger. She pretended to be so kind. I trusted her. I told her about my life with Arthur. That's precisely what makes her actions so insidious, Evelyn said. She exploited your trust and Arthur's vulnerability. We'll need to gather everything that can corroborate her motives and her methods. Evelyn suggested I start with the most difficult task, medical records. Oregon has strict privacy laws, but as a spouse, you have the right to access certain information. We need records that show the progression of Arthur's illness, his cognitive functions in the period leading up to November 2024. This was the beginning of my own investigation. I became a detective in my own life. I pulled out all the old calendars, the diaries I kept, noting Arthur's condition. I recorded every detail, when he forgot names, when he mixed up dates, when his speech became incoherent. My children often teased me about my meticulousness, calling me the family archivist. "Grandma, why do you write all this down? No one's going to read it," Emily would say. But now these records were priceless. They were my voice when Arthur had lost his. I began to organize all the financial documents, bank statements, bills, receipts. I looked for any suspicious transactions, large cash withdrawals, transfers. I remembered Brenda once asking me to help Arthur sign a check for urgent needs, but I hadn't thought anything of it. Now, every such instance raised my suspicion. The next step was to talk to people who knew Arthur and Brenda. This was the hardest part. I didn't want to air our dirty laundry, but Evelyn insisted. "We need witnesses, Mrs. Vance. People who might have noticed something strange." I started with our neighbors, the Johnsons, who lived across the street. They often saw Brenda coming and going. Mrs. Johnson, an elderly, kind woman, was surprised to hear about the will. "Oh, Eleanor, I'm so sorry. Arthur was such a good man." Brenda, she seemed so caring. But I did notice she always tried to make sure Arthur was alone when she visited. And also, once I saw her bring a man to the house. He looked like a lawyer or a notary. It was in November, I remember, because that's when I was preparing for Thanksgiving. This was the first confirmation. I felt a rush of adrenaline. My notes, my observations, my suspicions, all of it began to form a coherent picture. Then I contacted other nurses from the same agency who sometimes filled in for Brenda. Most were cautious, unwilling to get involved. But one, a young woman named Maria, was more open. "Mrs. Vance, I don't want to speak ill of colleagues, but Brenda. She was a bit strange. She always talked about how Arthur understood her, how he appreciated her more than anyone. And she always insisted I didn't ask him too many questions when I was alone. She said it confused him." Maria confirmed that Brenda often stayed longer than necessary and that she seemed to have an unusually strong influence over Arthur, even when he was in a very poor state. She always talked about his clear moments, but I almost never saw them. My children, Sarah and Michael, remained somewhat detached. They sympathized, but didn't grasp the depth of my struggle. Maybe you should just accept it? Sarah suggested once. It'll be so expensive and so much stress. Maybe Arthur really wanted this? These words wounded me deeply. They didn't understand. It wasn't just about the house. It was about my life, my honor, Arthur's memory. I felt that they, like many of their generation, were accustomed to quick fixes, to letting go of what seemed too complicated. My wisdom, my experience, my capacity for a long, painstaking fight, all of it seemed outdated to them. They were too busy with their virtual worlds and trendy pursuits to delve into the nuances of real life. I remembered trying to teach Emily how to can vegetables from my garden. Grandma, that takes so long. I'll just buy it at the store. Or how Michael dismissed my advice on caring for the old wooden floor in his apartment. Mom, that's too complicated. I'll just varnish it. They didn't see the value in patience, in manual labor, in preserving what had been built over years. But it was precisely these qualities, patience, attention to detail, the ability to plan long-term, that now became my weapon. I applied them to my investigation as if knitting an invisible net designed to catch Brenda. I wasn't just collecting facts. I was trying to understand Brenda's psychology, her motives, her methods. I read books about manipulation, about gaslighting, about how predators choose their victims. I realized that Brenda had used my fatigue, my trust, my love for Arthur against me. Evelyn Reed was more than just a lawyer. She was my mentor. She explained the concept of motivational interviewing to me, not a direct interrogation, but a subtle, empathetic conversation that allows a person to arrive at the truth themselves, to reveal information they might not want to disclose. People tend to trust those who listen to them, who show empathy, Evelyn explained. Your life experience, your wisdom, Mrs. Vance, will be your greatest advantage. I started practicing this. I called people who had worked with Brenda in other homes, under the guise of gathering information for the agency. I listened to them, asked open-ended questions, allowing them to speak. And gradually, bit by bit, I gathered information about Brenda, her financial difficulties, her propensity for gambling, her previous dismissals due to unethical behavior. She wasn't just a nurse who seized an opportunity, she was a predator who systematically sought out vulnerable victims. Tension mounted. My days were filled with calls, meetings, document analysis. My nights, with sleeplessness, filled with thoughts of the upcoming battle. I felt old, but at the same time, surprisingly alive. Every new discovery gave me a surge of strength. I was not just a victim, I was a hunter of truth. Evelyn prepared the official petition to contest the will. This meant Brenda Miller would be forced to appear in court and give testimony under oath. I knew it would be a difficult ordeal. Brenda was cunning, evasive. She would lie, deny, try to portray me as a crazy or vengeful old woman. But I was ready. My records, witness testimonies, financial documents, all of it was compiled. Evelyn was confident we had a strong position. Mrs. Vance, we will subpoena her financial records, her phone calls, her correspondence, Evelyn said. We will find evidence of her manipulations. I nodded. I felt my nerves stretched to their limit, but at the same time, a fire of determination burned within me. I couldn't lose. Not now, when I had come so far. One evening, as I was looking through old photos of Arthur, I stumbled upon his medical chart, which he had kept himself before the illness completely consumed him. He was an engineer, a very meticulous man. At the end of each month, he would record his thoughts, his feelings. I started rereading them. In the entries for October 2024, just a month before the new will was signed, Arthur wrote, "Brain like a fog. Forgetting words, faces. Eleanor is my anchor. Without her, I am lost. Brenda, she is too insistent. Talking about papers. I don't understand what she wants." This was it. Direct proof of his confused state, his inability to understand what he was doing, and a hint of pressure from Brenda. This was not just circumstantial evidence. It was Arthur's own voice, speaking from the fog of illness. I felt tears well up in my eyes. He had tried to tell me, to warn me. I immediately called Evelyn. "I found something," I said, my voice trembling with excitement. Arthur's diary. He wrote about his condition and about Brenda. Evelyn was thrilled. Mrs. Vance, this could be crucial evidence. It confirms not only his incapacity, but also possible undue influence. I felt the tension in my body begin to ease. This was a breakthrough. My meticulousness, my habit of keeping everything that seemed important, had finally paid off. This was my gift, which my family had ignored for so long. Now I was ready. I was ready for battle. I knew Brenda would resist, but I had a weapon she didn't expect. But what she learned or did next turned all expectations upside down. You won't believe how this ended. Arthur's diary became the missing link that tied all my scattered suspicions together. It was my husband's voice, breaking through the fog of illness to warn me. Evelyn Reed was ecstatic. "This isn't just proof of incapacity, Mrs. Vance," she said, holding the old notebook. "It's a testament to his will, his unwillingness to be manipulated. It's priceless." We filed the official petition to contest the will. The court date was set for late summer. Months of preparation, meetings, and depositions lay ahead. I knew Brenda Miller wouldn't give up without a fight. She was cunning, and I expected any trickery from her. The first step was Brenda's deposition. It wasn't a trial, but a sworn pretrial testimony, and it carried the same legal weight. We gathered in the law firm's conference room. The atmosphere was tense. Brenda arrived in a sharp suit, with a flawless hairstyle, looking calm and confident. Beside her sat her lawyer, a young but tenacious attorney who constantly whispered something in her ear. Evelyn began the questioning. She asked about Brenda's qualifications, her work with Arthur, her relationship with him. Brenda answered evenly, without emotion, like a memorized script. She insisted that Arthur was in his right mind during the moments they discussed the will, that he greatly appreciated her care and wanted to thank her. "Ms. Miller, did you ever discuss Mr. Vance's financial situation with him?" Evelyn asked. "We talked about his well-being in general, yes," Brenda replied. "I wanted to make sure he was provided for." "Were you aware that the house on Elmwood Drive was Mr. Vance's primary asset?" "I knew it was his house, yes." Then it was my turn. Evelyn had prepared me, explaining that I should use my motivational interviewing skills. Not to attack, but to listen, to ask open-ended questions that would make Brenda reveal herself, to show her true colors. I looked at Brenda. There wasn't a hint of remorse in her eyes. Only cold calculation. "Brenda," I began, my voice calm, almost sympathetic. "I remember Arthur sometimes confused me with my sister, and once he called me his mother. Do you remember such moments?" Brenda hesitated for a moment. "Well, sometimes, of course," his mind was a little clouded. "But those were rare moments." "Rare?" I raised an eyebrow. "What about the day he tried to feed his shoe?" Her lawyer intervened. "Objection. That's irrelevant." "It is relevant," Evelyn calmly stated. "We are discussing Mr. Vance's capacity." I continued. "Brenda, do you remember Arthur talking about his long-held desire to leave the house to me? We discussed it for years. He always said this house was our joint creation." Brenda swallowed. I don't recall such conversations. He always told me he wanted me to be happy. And he expressed a desire to leave you the house, even though he knew it would leave his wife homeless." My voice became a little sharper. "He said I deserved it," Brenda replied, her voice growing slightly louder. "I took care of him when no one else did." This was her mistake. She revealed her resentment, her sense of deservingness, which often drives such manipulators. She tried to portray herself as a victim, and me as ungrateful. No one else. I allowed a slight smile to appear on my lips. "I cared for him for 10 years, Brenda. 10 years. You were with him for 2 years. And in those 2 years, you convinced him to change a will that had existed for almost half a century." She began to get nervous. Her composure wavered. "I didn't convince him. He decided that himself." "And what about the notary you brought to the house in November?" Evelyn suddenly changed direction. Brenda paled. I don't know what you're talking about." "Mrs. Johnson, your neighbor, saw him," Evelyn continued. "And we have records of phone calls to the number of a notary who specializes in home-based will drafting." "Calls from your phone, Brenda." Brenda fell silent. Her lawyer tried to say something, but Evelyn didn't let him. "And what about Mr. Vance's diary?" Evelyn placed the old notebook in front of Brenda. Do you remember him writing about the fog in his mind and your insistence with papers? Brenda's face contorted. This was the moment of truth. She realized her lies were exposed. Her eyes flashed with anger, but she was trapped. It's a fake, she screamed. She set it all up. Set up a diary that Arthur kept for years, with his handwriting, with his thoughts. I shook my head. Brenda, you underestimated Arthur. And you underestimated me. This deposition was just the beginning. We continued to gather evidence. My children, Sarah and Michael, finally grasped the seriousness of the situation. They saw how I fought, how I painstakingly gathered information, how I used my wisdom and patience. They started to help, looking for Arthur's old letters, talking to his former colleagues. They saw that my meticulousness and old-fashioned methods proved far more effective than their quick, superficial solutions. Mom, I didn't know you were this strong, Michael said one day as we sat in the kitchen, sorting through another stack of documents. Strength comes with experience, dear, I replied. And with necessity. Finally, the day of the court hearing arrived. The judge, an elderly woman with a perceptive gaze, listened attentively. Evelyn presented our evidence, Arthur's medical records, testimonies from doctors, neighbors, and other nurses, financial transactions, and, of course, Arthur's diary. Brenda and her lawyer tried to refute our arguments, portraying me as a vengeful widow and Arthur as a man who, at the last moment, decided to change his will. But their arguments crumbled under the weight of the facts. The climax came when Evelyn read an excerpt from Arthur's diary, where he wrote about his confused state and Brenda's pressure. Arthur's voice, recorded on paper, resonated in the courtroom as if alive. Brenda sat with her head down, her face pale. The judge delivered her ruling. The will, drafted on November 15, 2024, was declared invalid. The house on Elmwood Drive was returned to me, Eleanor Vance. I felt an enormous weight lift from my shoulders. Tears welled up in my eyes, tears of relief, triumph, but also sadness. I had won, but the price had been high. I had lost Arthur and then almost lost the home that was our shared world. After the hearing, Brenda quickly left the courtroom without looking at me. Her lawyer merely shrugged. Justice had prevailed, but this was just the beginning. A few weeks later, as Evelyn and I were finalizing the last documents, she mentioned something that made me freeze. Mrs. Vance, during the investigation, we discovered something interesting about Brenda Miller. It seems she's not just a lone predator. She's part of a larger network that specializes in elderly individuals with dementia. They find vulnerable victims, gain their trust, and then try to transfer their property or gain access to their finances. My heart clenched. A network? Yes, Evelyn nodded. We've passed this information on to the prosecutor's office. Your case, perhaps, is just the tip of the iceberg. Thanks to your persistence, your records, your attention to detail, we not only got your house back, but we may have prevented a much larger catastrophe for other seniors. This was the unexpected twist. My personal fight for justice, my meticulousness, which my family had long considered an oddity, turned out to be more than just saving my home. It uncovered an entire scheme that could have ruined the lives of many others. My wisdom, my ability to see details, my capacity for long, painstaking work, all of it proved to be not just old-fashioned, but vitally important. I returned home. The house felt different. It was mine again, but now it was filled not only with memories of Arthur, but also with the echo of my struggle, my victory. I sat on the porch, watching the sunset over Portland. Sarah and Michael came to me. They brought my favorite apple crisp, which, it turned out, Emily had baked herself, using my recipe. Grandma, Emily said, her eyes full of tears. We are so proud of you. We didn't understand what you went through. And thank you for everything. Ben, my usually quiet grandson, came over and hugged me. You're the coolest grandma, Grandma. You're like a superhero. I smiled. In their eyes, I saw not just respect, but understanding. They finally saw the value in my wisdom, in my experience, in my old-fashioned methods. They understood that true strength isn't in speed or technology, but in patience, in attention to detail, in the ability to fight for what's right, even when all seems lost. My life changed. I didn't just get my house back, I got myself back. I became stronger, wiser, and most importantly, I reconnected with my family. They started coming to me, listening to my stories, asking for advice. Emily began learning to bake. Ben started to take an interest in the history of our house. My wisdom, my gift, which had been ignored for so long, was finally appreciated. I understood that justice isn't always a loud victory in court. Sometimes it's a quiet, but profound realization that changes people. My story became a lesson for my family, a lesson about the value of patience, the importance of fighting for truth, and that the wisdom of the older generation is not a relic of the past, but a priceless resource that can save from far greater catastrophes than those visible on the surface. I looked at my home, at its old walls that had seen so much. Now they were witnesses not only to my pain, but also to my triumph and a new beginning for my family.